Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to start out with a graphic that pretty much encapsulates an overarching goal that WWF uses to look at the goal of wildlife thriving. Now, I don't want to spend any time going into these two main drivers of wildlife decline and our approach to that and how we tackle that aspect. What I really want to point out here is the absolute importance of this foundation of community wildlife stewardship and benefits. Without that, there is no way we're going to achieve this goal of wildlife thriving. And one really critical aspect in building and maintaining that foundation is tackling some long-standing thorny issues like human-wildlife conflict. Coexisting with wildlife, we know, is an old and difficult challenge, and especially when it comes to coexisting with carnivores. I mean, they not only prey on our livestock and our pets, they eat us and they injure us. And they also create a landscape of fear for those people that live and walk amongst them. So as we achieve our carnivore conservation actions, our goals, as we've discussed, we become, we're in greater proximity to carnivores, and greater proximity means increased conflict. And because of that, as we get better and better, we have to get more and more clever at how we deal with human-wildlife conflict and some of the solutions that we come up with. So today, I'm talking from a very practical basis, no theory here. I just really wanted to give you a few examples that WWF is either using or testing around their global network to help mitigate human-wildlife conflict. So I'm going to start first in the Arctic and use some examples from polar bears. And then I'll shift to the tropics and discuss some examples from East and Southern Africa. And in both of these sets of examples, I'll be starting out with communities using very simple traditional approaches, and then showing how the addition of a bit of a tweak, some new ideas, some new innovations, a little technology, can really help push those traditional approaches forward. And finally, I'll end with a holistic approach, an integrated approach to human-wildlife conflict that WWF has been developing and testing across its network. So let me start with some very basic community patrols to minimize human polar bear conflict. As everyone's aware, polar bears are experiencing melting, decreased sea ice, and that's causing them to become more terrestrial and come into communities and penetrate community boundaries. So there's much greater potential for conflict. Well, WWF has been working with communities in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Russia to train them or to work with them to help organize perimeter controls so they can, or perimeter patrols, so they can go out and identify where the bears are and then do some pretty simple things to chase them away, like noise, sprays, even throwing bean bags and rubber bullets. So, and also to be able to alert your community members as to where the bears are. And this has actually shown some success. I mean, the numbers aren't great, but in Arviat Nunavut in Canada, since WWF has been organizing the communities, life-threatening interactions with polar bears have gone down to zero, well, to an average of less than 1 over the last 3 years since that has been active. But let's throw a little technology in here. WWF Netherlands came up with the idea for a human-wildlife tech challenge last year. And this came about as part of our relationship with the Wild Labs Net, which is a coalition of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs that focus on cutting-edge technology for conservation. So one of the winning proposals was looking at new advances in infrared technologies so they could help do an early warning system to identify when polar bears are coming close to a community and alert community members that they are there. Now, the really important thing about this is that, that the sensors that they're working with, these infrared sensors, are able to tell the difference between, say, a dog and a polar bear. They also have to operate in very poor light because of the long nights in the north, and they need to be cost effective. We want these to be out with communities that aren't necessarily, highly wealthy communities, and so can afford the sensors. And also, we want them to be able to notify community members in real time. So far, the work has gone really well. It's progressed with elephants, tigers, and now penguins. But polar bears have been a little bit difficult because they have very thick insulating fur, and it's hard for the heat sensor to detect them. So you can see here that the number of pixels, in the sensor needs to be much higher in order to capture a good graphic of a polar bear. And also, we need to have a really hardy sensor for this to work in low temperatures. So basically, this is what we want to achieve, an array of low-cost sensors with good detection in real-time alert. So you've got your polar bear over here coming close to the community. Put this up in a hot spot, someplace that like crops, food caches, and tourist sites. And the sensor says, whoa, we've got a polar bear here, and sends an SMS message in real time to community members so they can avoid confrontation or go back and ensure that their livestock is protected or whatever. And one advantage one improvement we can also make with community patrols is to improve the monitoring, the evaluation, using things like SMART, which is the Spatial Monitoring and Reporting Tool. Now, this is something that's been used primarily in protected area management, but it really can help at the community level and allow for greater integration of data from the community level to the regional and national level. And what's really great about this tool is that it's free, it's easy to use, you can collect it on smartphones, it's near real-time response, it stores lots of data, but the really important thing is that you can evaluate patrol efforts and results and conflict levels. So you can say that the community's been patrolling too much in this one area, for example, or you can map out where the polar bear conflicts have occurred. And the other thing is it's driven by the user community. So this tool is being used by Maasai in Kenya, and they develop the icons to represent things that mean something to them. And this can be the same anywhere in the world. So SMART's been developed by WWF and 7 other conservation agencies, and it's supported by a really broad coalition of donors and users. And it's used by more than 600 sites globally, but to date, as I said, has not been widely applied to human-wildlife conflict. And what's interesting is that it's virtually absent in use in Europe. So there's huge potential out there for this tool to be used by many of you who are working on this continent. And also, just to summarize it, for the potential for using SMART to monitor and manage polar bear conflict, you've got the ability to track at the community level, bring alerts in from the field, have improved data transfer between the field, and really enhance rapid response and adapt your local management. But the big thing is that you can integrate your data. It's not a centralized database. It's decentralized. Great, thank you. Sorry for that delay. And yeah, I just skipped ahead to bring up this slide that shows that we're working to implement the application of SMART, the use of that tool, in Norway in 2018 and 2019. And then we'll conduct a needs assessment for the rest of the polar bear range states in hopes that they will be interested and willing to implement SMART throughout all the range states by 2020. And if you want any more information about SMART, you can jot down that website. Okay, let me shift to the tropics and to East Africa, where I'll also present an example of a very traditional approach to preventing lion depredation that's been improved by a very interesting and simple innovation. I think most of you are aware that in Africa, livestock is brought into corrals or bomas at night to protect it from predators. And usually the pastoralists light fires to keep the predators away or use torches, but you know, you're up much of the night, or you bring in your dogs. But this wonderfully clever 11-year-old boy named Richard Tureri, a Maasai from the Amboseli area, decided that he was just really tired of staying up all night. So he took a car battery, a couple of LED lights, and basically for $10 created a system of blinking lights that emulated a night guard walking around the boma. And the success of his very simple innovation has been huge. And like any simple and effective innovation, it's been very popular, it's been adapted, adopted, and implemented quite broadly. And WWF Kenya has been working with a group called the Wildlife Foundation to apply Tureri's system. And we've got something like, well, over 650 corrals in East and Southern Africa, and really try to strategically work in areas where there were wildlife corridors or conflict hotspots. And you know, I think the setup costs around $300 per set, because we're not only doing a corral now, we're also lighting people's houses next to the boma. So the community gives a certain percentage towards the cost, and they get lights. And what has been wonderful is the data aren't statistically evaluated or anything, but it looks as though depredations are down, retaliatory killings with poison are down, and it's a real win-win because academic scores are up because young Maasai can study at night. And staying in Africa, I wanted to present an example that's being developed by WWF Namibia that focuses on financial rewards. And this is an approach called wildlife credits that's sort of a break in convention because it takes the concept of making wildlife a competitive land use option. So you provide additional incentives for communities that are actively conserving these conflict species. And this occurs through payment for conservation performance. As I have here, more wildlife, more reward. And it also provides a new way for global stakeholders to potentially share in the costs and participate in conservation across the globe. I won't go into it in detail, but they're also exploring how to apply a blockchain solution to the trade chain, well, the transaction chain. So what happens here is that payments must be linked to verifiable wildlife conservation performance. So for example, wildlife sightings. You may have a joint venture with a tourism group, and the tour operators provide the independent monitoring activity, oversight. And then you might get paid, the community might get paid for maintaining a wildlife corridor. And that could be verified through satellite imagery every year. Is there development in that corridor? Are there livestock seen in that corridor? Or even with camera traps, you can ensure that in this case, leopard are walking through the area. And also, a lot of animals carry satellite collars. You can provide payments for actual presence per day of a collared animal on your property. So, a really interesting new system. And the scheme is set up such that conservancies, community conservancies, sign a contract with a national credit fund holder. And they state the reward conditions, they state how much and what, so what, depending on some of the independent measures that I talked about in the previous slide. And funding to the communities comes from local, national, and international sources. So the local would be the participating lodges that pay a fixed amount for each sighting. It goes into a local conservancy fund. And then you have a national matching fund, along with hopefully international sponsors that give to this national credit fund, and once a year that would be distributed out to the local conservancies. And the local conservancies have a set of trustees and partner with NGOs or another joint venture source, and they sit down and decide how they want to distribute those funds. So nobody is telling them, you're gonna compensate Ollie over there for his loss, but they decide. They decide if they want to do payments, research and monitoring, or management and protective services, whatever. So it gives the communities control of their destinies and a lot of dignity. Okay, all of those things that I have presented so far are very good tools for mitigating human-wildlife conflict, but they're standalone tools quite often. And you can say, we've put up the blinking lights, the lions are staying away, but you can still have zero tolerance from the community for lions, and poisoning continues. Or you can set up a wonderful early warning system and great community patrols for polar bears. But if you're not managing your waste, you're not going to win. So this approach, called the SAFE systems, which has been developed by Ashley Brooks of WWF, who I believe is in the audience, takes a very integrated, holistic look at human-wildlife conflict. And it looks at all 6 identified elements of conflict, including understanding the conflict, so the data come in here, monitoring, mitigation, response, prevention, and policy. These are all elements that go together to make an area safe and allow you to establish a safe baseline. Okay, so SAFE really takes lessons from the transport sector. And this is a graph of vehicles on the road from the United States in the little red bars, so increasing. And the blue is the number of fatalities. And you can see early on that as more and more cars got on the road, we had more and more fatalities. But something happened around the early 1970s. And that's when the United States got serious about regulations for traffic. I mean, I was learning how to drive then. I didn't wear a seatbelt. They weren't even installed, far less an airbag. And you know, you hung your arms out the window to give turn signals. And for those who really wanted to drink and drive, there was a nice little container on the side. So all of those things were controlled after this, and the number of cars and the fatalities began to decouple. This is what we want to see with conservation. We want more and more carnivores on the landscape, but fewer and fewer fatalities. So how did transport do it? Well, they broke a very complex system into basic parts. You've got the environment, the driver, the vehicle, and the speed of the car. Okay, and you need to figure out how to make each one of those elements safe. So, you know, the driver needs to be trained. It's great if he has a license. He better be sober, and he needs to be compliant and insured. You know, the car should be registered in good working conditions. It better have brakes, and the tires need tread. So, and also, we don't want any obstructions in the passageway. So, we did the same thing with wildlife and the whole aspect of making an area safe in building this thinking. You've got the person, you've got the assets, you've got the data and knowledge, the wildlife, and the environment. And you want to make sure, if the area is safe, that the person isn't hunting, that they're conducting wildlife-friendly farming, that they can fund prevention. Your tiger here needs to have space, it needs to be protected and can't have access to crops, on and on. I think you get the picture. And we've developed a whole set in consultation with stakeholders and our colleagues across the network of criteria that define a safe person, safe assets, safe wildlife, etc. And these criteria, we then go in with local stakeholders and evaluate where their situation lies. So if you have, you know, here we've got, sorry. And I will be finished. Yeah, so it allows you to evaluate how good you are on these various axes. So a perfect score would have this spider diagram all the way out. But here we see that after evaluating our criteria, safe person is pretty far off. And we're going to have a problem here with safe assets. So it allows you to know what your baseline is, that you have a high chance of regular conflict. You know, you have a high reliance on patrolling, a potential loss of tolerance. You've got a high chance here of conflict impacts on livelihoods. But you've got pretty good policies and a good situation with wildlife. So this approach provides a really excellent basis for defining that baseline and allows us to go back and check from time to time and develop your strategy and then come back and check and see how you've improved or not. And we've actually been rolling this out and conducted 29 rapid assessment workshops in China, Indonesia, Nepal, Bhutan, Kenya, and India. And you bring together stakeholders from the villages, the local governments, the rangers, all the NGOs, and a lot of times this is the first time that all these stakeholders have come together, so it's a really powerful workshop where they come and go through the criteria, set the safe baseline, and then synthesize the actions needed to develop the safe strategy. So in a nutshell, it's a very systematic process. You compile the human-wildlife conflict information. You do a rapid assessment stakeholder workshop, you develop the SAFE strategy, implement and monitor, and then go back and review and tweak things. So in summary, I think you gave me a hands up there. I would say that we can use traditional, simple approaches at the community level to achieve a lot of really good mitigation of human-wildlife conflict. It's foundational. But I think we can augment as much as possible with new technology and little innovative ideas that can carry those things much further. And ultimately, we need that holistic approach. So be smart and be safe. Thank you.